Well, it turns out I actually did know what to do. And it had nothing to do with the specific circumstance. What I needed to do was to provide him the things he could not provide for himself. And we talk in NL, we talk about enabling. And one of the definitions of enabling is getting between somebody and the consequences of their action and doing for them things that they can or should have done for themselves, right?
Well, hello, friends of Bill W. and other friends. You have landed on Sober Speak. My name is John M. I am an alcoholic, and we are glad you're all here, especially newcomers. Newcomers, that is, both to recovery as a whole and newcomers to this podcast. Sober Speak is a podcast about recovery centered around the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. My job here on Sober Speak is simple. My job is to provide a platform to the amazing stories of recovery all around us. Consider Sober Speak, if you will, your meeting between meetings. Please remember, we do not speak for AA or any 12-step community. We represent only ourselves. We are here to share our experience, strength, and hope with those who wish to come along for the ride. Take what you want and leave the rest at the curb for the trash man to pick up. Greetings from Studio AA, deep in the heart of Texas. That was our friend Spencer T. that you heard at the beginning of this here episode, and you are going to hear so much more from him in just a moment. But first things first, this here episode is made possible by Kurt, Todd, Anonymous, Audrey, Terry, and Mary Lynn. And you ask yourself, you say to yourself, you say, self, what did they do on that little John M. podcast to deserve such a mention? Well, let me tell you what Kurt, Todd, Anonymous, Audrey, Terry, and Mary Lynn did. They visited our humble little website, www.soberspeak.com. They clicked on the little yeller. Actually, it's some places it's yeller and some places it's not yeller. But nonetheless, they clicked on the donation tab and they made a contribution. So thank you so much, Kurt, Todd, Anonymous, Audrey, Terry, and Mary Lynn. This here episode is coming right out to Ewan's. So, as I always do, I pray right before we started here. I don't know if it works, but it makes me feel better. There's some sort of peace I get inside by doing it, and that is I just pray that hopefully we can put something out on a recording here that'll give somebody somewhere hope, perhaps where they may not have any hope. In one of these four corners of the world, you never really know exactly what's going on and who's listening to it and what sort of impact it may or may not have. But hopefully this episode is one that you need to hear today. And I wanted to read a little bit of listener feedback right before we start this on the front end. This came in from Rebecca. Rebecca writes in, and the subject line is Holding the Light. And she says, hello, John. I found your podcast through the Harbor Area Central Office here in the Los Angeles, California area. I have recently been diagnosed as blind and a candidate for the Braille Institute. Nonetheless, I am an alcoholic through and through. Your podcasts have saved my life and my sanity. The voices of women in recovery have been like a tall, cool glass of water on a hot summer day. My favorite is Tracy J. Please let her know how much the City of Angels appreciates her. With love and respect, Rebecca A. Sobriety date, August 28th of 1992. Well, as you know, Rebecca copied Tracy on that email, and she and I were both just so grateful to receive it. Thank you for taking time out of your day to write in. As I told you, that made my day. I so much appreciate it. So much appreciate it. All right, let's get on to Mr. Spencer T. And this is part one of 2 episodes. This is called In All Our Affairs. Spencer is actually from Ann Arbor, Michigan. And we're going to release these 2 episodes back to back. When I say we started, the plan at least, when Spencer came over here to Studio AA, was to record a kind of a short recording, but fortunately it turned into a much longer conversation than I anticipated. And as Spencer knows, I was kind of going back and forth on text with him, and I was in the middle of a very hectic week. But when the one and only Spencer T is in town, offers to pop by Studio AA, one does not turn down that offer. Even though I did have to pray about it because of the week I was having, it was really hectic. And I told Spencer this, but my mind was saying, you're just too busy. But my spirit and my higher power told me to do it. And I'm glad I listened to my higher power and I listened to that gut instinct. And you, ladies and gents, are going to be pleased as well. You will notice during this episode, Spencer and I are talking about the eclipse. I told him I had a lot of backed up. I had many episodes backed up. I didn't know when this was going to get out, but you could tell it's been a while since we recorded these episodes. And you will notice a hard stop at this episode because before we hop onto you'll notice that hard stop, and then we hop onto the second part of this here docudrama. I like that word, docudrama. Anyway, he says, what do we talk about? Oh, let me get to my notes here. So, you'll also notice me screwing up at the beginning of this episode, talking about some of Spencer's previous episodes on Sober Speak. So, if you are out there in the ethosphere and you're thinking, how do I get a hold? Well, there's a couple different ways to get a hold of Spencer's other podcast. Number one, if you want to listen to him on Sober Speak, it's episode number 25, episode number 82, and episode number 131. Spencer's been on in the past. And then if you want to get a hold of Spencer and his podcast, not get a hold, but if you want to listen to Spencer and his podcast, well, you can also get a hold of him through the website. You go to The Recovery Show, and I will put a link to his website in the show notes. The site and the podcast are chock full of nuts with very, very helpful Al-Anon information. So in this episode, part one, and like I said, we'll follow up with part 2 next week, Spencer discusses his surrender date of April 10th, 2002, and what that means, his church life as a youth leader and how he has blended that into his recovery program, how Spencer practices the principles in all his affairs, and some very specific examples we can all learn from, his life in, quote, retirement, and how he is navigating that new routine now that he is in retirement, and the subject of enablement, and much, much more. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy Mr. Spencer T, and we will have plenty, listener feedback at the end of this episode. Enjoy. Okay, everybody, so we have a very special guest in the house, literally in the house today.
Yeah.
And this just kind of came up at the last second because of some of Spencer's travel. But first of all, Spencer, I'm going to go ahead and have you introduce yourself, give your surrender date, if you will, and tell people where you live in this area. And then we'll talk about what brought you in here as well.
Okay. Yeah, my name's Spencer T, and I count as my surrender date April 10th, 2002. That is the date at which I figuratively at least hit my knees and came into a program of recovery.
So April 10th of 2022 or 2002. And I also want to let people know that Spencer has been on the pod many times in the past. And I'm going to put this in the show notes, but I just want to let people know on the front end, he was on episode number 25 in June of 2018, episode number 82 in June of 2019, and episode number 131 with Amy, right? Yeah, in May of 2022. Did I get that right? No, I think I got those backwards.
Yeah, we'll fix it.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. It's fine.
I will put the links.
I know Amy and I were down here in May of 2019, and we had lots of alarms and excursions where we were, but we managed to come up here and record an episode with you. So that might be the one that came out in June of 2019.
That is in June of 2019. Yeah. You were absolutely straight.
And then we had an episode where I started talking about doing the steps in Al-Anon.
Oh, that's right. Yes. And that's episode number 131. Yeah. You were correct. So, and have you ever recorded another podcast with Amy?
Nope.
Have you ever done
it? That was a one-off, man.
Yeah, it was great. I loved it. We got a lot of feedback on that one.
Well, good. Yeah, so I am down here in Texas again. Oh, where do I live in this great land of ours? Yes. I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yeah.
And as those of you who listen to my podcast, which is the Recovery Show, have heard, I retired a few months ago, and we had planned a long time ago, I think in 2017, when that eclipse went across the country the other direction, we said, we missed that one, but we said, well, Amy's got a high school friend who has property right in the middle of the totality in Texas. And we thought it would be more likely that it would be not cloudy down here in Texas than it would be up in, well, we would have had to go down to Ohio to see it. And it just felt like April in Ohio was probably more likely to be cloudy than April in Texas. So put those things all together. We've been planning this trip for a number of years, and then it all came together. I have a dog. The dog does not do well when we're not at home. We have to hire a house sitter / dog sitter who works the same job that my wife works, which is doing taxes, and thus is not available as a dog sitter in April. So I said, look, I'm retired. I can drive. The dog can come with me.
Yeah.
And you can fly down for whatever period of time makes sense for you. So that's what we did. So I've been down here for about a week.
Yeah.
I just drove Amy to the airport.
Yeah.
She'll be boarding a plane shortly.
Yeah. And we can see your dog right out the window.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So that's how I got physically here and sort of mentally here. We did come to see the eclipse. We also came to see friends that we haven't seen in a while. Cause like I said, it's been 5 years since 2019, since I've been down to Texas.
How did the eclipse thing work out for you?
Well, I'll tell you what, God was smiling on us because there were little clouds, and at the time of totality, there was just sort of these scattered little high up clouds, and it was amazing. I took 200 photographs.
Did you have to have a special lens?
I actually went out and bought a long telephoto.
Wow.
For this purpose, but it also will be good for taking pictures of birds, which is something that I like to do. So it's not like I dropped a bunch of money on something I'm going to use once. I will use it going forward. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and I said to my wife, I want to buy this lens. She's like, well, you probably have been thinking about it for a long time. I said, yes, I have. So it all came together. We are camping in a travel trailer that my wife owns by a lake on the far side of Fort Worth from here. It's about an hour and a half drive or something. Mm-hmm. But since I was coming to the airport, worked out really nice. So that's probably enough chit chat.
Well, and I also want to say that I found it very interesting. I don't think I've ever. So we have 350 or so episodes, or 320, something like that, episodes, and never has somebody sat down to do a recording with me and asked me how their mic level is.
Well, as a podcaster, this is something I do every time I get somebody on.
And maybe we should just make sure everybody knows about this, because you and I both know that you're a podcaster. By the way, you were the guy who basically I stole your format, is what it comes down to, right? And
you've made it your own, though.
Well,
you really have made it your own.
Well, and so you are. Tell them about your podcast and what it's all about, and why you have a surrender date as opposed to sobriety date.
So my podcast is called The Recovery Show, which is a name that a friend of mine actually came up with.
The
Recovery Show. Yeah, a little bit of hubris there, maybe. I'll just say the friend who picked the name for me is an alcoholic. Might have something to do with it.
Yeah.
But it was something where the domain name was available that said, it was about recovery. I mean, it's pretty obvious. It is a recovery show. It is a show based on the experience of those of us who have recovered from the effects of somebody else's drinking or drugging on ourselves. And my personal program is Al-Anon, which is a program for people whose lives have been affected by somebody else's alcoholism. Mm-hmm. Our tradition 3 says, in part, the only requirement for membership is that there be a problem of alcoholism in a relative or friend.
Yes, so that's... and that's the difference between our traditions, right? I mean, they're very similar, as you know.
The steps differ in one word. In step 12, the AA step 12 says that you carry the message to alcoholics. The Al-Anon step 12 says that we carry the message to others. And I always like to say, some of us have been trying to carry the message to alcoholics for too long, and we need to just stop.
And I also noticed another phrase that you used there. There's a big phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous where it says, we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless
state of
mind and body, right? You said what we have recovered from what?
The effects of somebody else's, I say drinking or drugging.
Yeah.
For the podcast, Al-Anon is pretty specific about alcoholism, although people do come in with, a relative, a loved one I've talked to people whose, loved one is marijuana addiction, opiate addiction, gambling addiction, sex addiction. And there are Anon programs for those, but Al-Anon's the biggest one with the most meetings. And so, we get people who are dealing with different kinds of addictions. And although the program says alcoholism, I feel like if somebody comes into the rooms of Al-Anon and the message they hear connects to them, then they need to be there. And, they may discover that alcohol's involved too.
Right. Yeah, we get a lot of coming through the back door.
Yeah. The outside issues.
Yes.
So I'm pretty liberal in that respect.
Yeah.
Other people disagree.
Yeah, I've become much more liberal in my perspective of, who can and who can't be in AA and all that sort of stuff throughout the years. I think it's very natural to want to defend something, especially when you're first sober or an Al-Anon or something like that, to the T. But eventually you kind of soften up a little bit.
Yeah, is what it is. So why do I say surrender date? Because, obviously I can't say sobriety date. some people say serenity date. Well, I sure as heck did not have any serenity the day I walked into my first Al-Anon meeting. But what I did have was total and abject surrender to the fact that I was not able to control or cure my wife's drinking, and that day I was at a treatment center. She was in her, I like to say, first inpatient. Her story is her story, and you heard some of it when we did our episode together. And that day, one of the counselors, whoever was giving presentations for us, said, "You didn't cause it, you can't cure it, and you can't control it." And when I heard those words, I felt like this weight came off of me, of this thing that I had been trying to do, that this guy was telling me now it was not my job. I didn't have to do it. But at the same time, I was not in a good place in my life. My life was unmanageable, as step one says. And the other thing that happened that day is I picked up this little flyer. I had heard about Al-Anon, but I'm like, I don't need a 12-step program. She needs a 12-step program. I don't need a 12-step program, right? Okay. Little bit of arrogance there, a little bit of denial, a little bit of not really understanding how my response to her disease had made my life unmanageable, how deeply it had affected me, right? So that day I was like, okay, I guess I need to do something. I've heard about this Al-Anon thing. They had a little flyer, has 20 questions. I think the AA has a similar one. Mm-hmm. I answered yes to 16 of the questions. And at the bottom it says, if you answered yes to one or more question, you may find Al-Anon to be of help or something, I was like, 16 is more than one. Maybe. So I went to my first Al-Anon meeting that night. And when I came out, what I knew was I was not alone. And I think I've heard, alcoholics express that also, that, this is not a unique problem that I'm the only person in the world that has. And there are other people who really understand it, other people who are still living it. And I don't know if I knew it that night, but after a few more meetings, because, I felt a little better, so I came back, right? I started to realize that there were people who were in equally troublesome situations, shall we say, equally frustrating, equally fearful, but they were living their life differently. They had this thing, some of them at least had this thing called serenity and happiness. And I was like, I kind of want that. So what I heard, the way I understood the program was go to meetings, read the literature, get a sponsor, work the steps. So that's what I did. And I got better. She didn't get better for a while, but I got better. And it's possible that me taking my hands off the steering wheel then helped her to find her way to sobriety for herself instead of sobriety for me, instead of sobriety for her children, instead of sobriety for her job, which she had lost by the time she actually found sobriety. I don't know. And it doesn't matter. And I'm actually grateful that she found sobriety for herself and not because of me.
Did you have a relationship with any sort of higher power, God, before you came in?
Nope. Nope, not really.
So did that scare you?
I was at best an agnostic.
Yeah.
There might be something, there might not be. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. My relationship with my higher power now is if I listen, when I listen, I will hear guidance that will lead me to better outcomes than I might find on my own. Mm-hmm. I'm not a person who believes that there's a plan. I'm not a person who believes that everything happens for a reason. But I do know, and I know from personal experience, that there is something greater than me that works in my life when I let it. that's where I am.
Yeah. And I'm just curious about that piece. So like, how did that start to form in the beginning? And has it changed much
There
over
were
the
some
years?
things that happened. One of the things that happened, I was really, really angry. I would like scream at my kids at the slightest provocation. I would yell at my coworkers. And then I always had to apologize. I'm sorry. I don't know why I did that. I won't do it again. And of course, I did it again. Sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how far into Al-Anon I was, but it was less than a year. And I realized that my rage was gone. Okay. And I know that no human power could have relieved me of that because I had tried. I had tried and tried to not yell at my coworkers, to not scream at my kids. And it kept happening, you know? And so something was working in my life. So that was one thing. There were some other sort of more trivial incidents that happened, like when somebody totaled one of our cars and we got just the amount of money we needed to pay for the first month of my wife's inpatient. You know, like, how did that happen?
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like that. When she went to a long-term residential program, like 4 months or something. And when she came out sober for a while, she wanted to replace our wedding rings that we had gotten when we were younger. And they were kind of hippie wedding rings with opal inlay that kept getting damaged and having to be replaced. And, you know, they were just fragile. And she wanted, you know, older people wedding rings, right? So we went to a jeweler, you know, the high-end jeweler in town, and she found a ring that she loved. And it was, I'll just say, a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
It was more money than I was willing to pay. And I probably said something about that. I'm pretty sure I did. And then a few days later, I was just walking down the street and this voice in my head, this still quiet voice in my head said, you know, this is really important to her. You should go ahead and get it. And what happened was we went to another jeweler. She found one that she liked just as much for half the price.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But so there were these incidents where I actually could hear or feel or see my higher power working in my life. And that's where I am now. Some days I'm like, really? And other days I'm like, yes, hang on. You know?
So I've heard you talk about, because we have a similar background. I think you work with the kids at the church and that kind of thing, right?
I do, yeah.
And I've done that as well. And so I'm wondering, how do you sync all that up with going to a church and, you know?
So the church that I go to, I'm not going to say the name, but it's a very, very liberal religion.
Yeah.
Where we care more about what people do
Right.
than what they believe. I think that's the easiest way to put it. And it very much like, you know, a lot of the 12-step programs are very accepting of people wherever they are in their spiritual journey. And one of the things for me is almost at the same time I came to Al-Anon, I came back to this church that I had grown up in as a child, not knowing that I really needed it until I got there, right? And at that time, you know, I had a very intellectual religious experience, right? About doing the right thing and so on, but not very spiritual. And as my spirituality developed, as I was in the recovery program, I didn't have to change churches because I was supported and accepted in my journey. And that's one of the things that I love about that community. So I'm back working with the high school kids. I was working with the high school kids for almost a decade. And then For about 4 years, I moved down to seventh grade, which was an interesting change. Seventh graders have a much wider range of maturity,
Yeah.
shall I say,
Yeah.
in that 1 year.
Right.
There's this huge range of maturity. I was really glad to be able to apply some of the program principles of acceptance, of, letting people be who they are.
Mm-hmm.
When one girl wanted to spend our time together sort of sprawled underneath her chair, drawing pictures, that's okay because she was there.
Mm-hmm.
And she was not just there physically. And the same thing happens, to some extent, happens with the high school. We have a number of kids in the high school group who are, I think the current term is neurodivergent.
Yeah. I've heard of this. Is that what they're calling it nowadays?
They're autistic or ADHD or both.
Yeah.
Or something else. And, when the one kid spend most of the time sitting sort of back behind the sofas with earphones on, but occasionally he would, pop up and contribute or participate. It's like, okay, he wants to be here.
Right.
If this is what he needs to do in order to be here, then, we're going to let him do that. And I have said many times that the difference between leading the youth group at church and, say, being a high school teacher is we have no final. We have no list of things you have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
We're there to spend our time exploring things that are important, whatever those might be, and however those might or might not relate to what we thought the topic of the day was going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So it's right for me. And yeah, so I'm back with them and we'll see where that goes. I took a couple of years and said, I'm going to do adult things now. And then I got asked, hey, you want to come back? And I'm like, yeah, I think I do.
Oh, nice.
So that is one way in which I think being in recovery has brought that into my life. I really don't think that would be there. I don't think I'd be able to do it without the peace that I've found, the serenity that I've found, the ability to accept other people as they are that I've learned. And also the ability to, to say, no, that's not something I can do. I was very much a people pleaser. And they might have asked me to do it and I might have said yes, and then not really wanted to be there. And that is the worst thing you can do to a room full of teenagers because they will know you don't want to be there. and they will act according to that knowledge, right? So yeah, I wanted to talk some about other ways in which I've used my program in my life, in all our affairs, as Step 12 says.
And you said, and I just want to make sure we touch on this briefly, or you can talk as long as you want, but you are retired now, right?
I retired in the beginning of December 2023.
Wow.
My last day of work was December 1st. You know why December 1st?
Why?
Well, number one, it was a Friday. Okay, so that's convenient. But number two, that meant I got another month of health insurance.
Right.
And I'm old enough to qualify for Medicare, and I'm all signed up for it. And there's some other stories that go along with retirement, but they don't necessarily belong here. So yeah, as I said before we started, one of the things I'm trying to figure out in retirement is what is my routine? Because it's not what it's been. I started working for a paycheck when I was 18. So in 1973.
Mm.
There were some times when I was going to school, but that's still a full-time job. Going to college is a full-time job. And actually, most of the time I was in college and most of the time I was in grad school, I also had a job to at least well, in grad school to pay the rent and get groceries and stuff. When I was an undergrad, it was, to have some walking around money because I was fortunate that my parents were able to pay for my undergrad education. It was a little cheaper back then.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just say. So I have been working for 50 years, and that has structured my life, right? And now I'm not working, and I don't yet know what the structure of my life is. And so I'm having to spend some time in discernment and some time in prayer and meditation to understand, how do I want my life to be now? And I've just been kind of winging it,
Yeah.
and that's not working as well as I would like it to. I'm
What do you
not
mean by
able
that?
to get to some of the things not able. I don't get to some of the things that I want to get to all the time. And one of those things is getting back on a regular schedule with my podcast.
Well, that's interesting because you would think you would have more time, right?
You would think I would have more time. Exactly. But I feel like not having that structure that said, here is the time that you can work on the podcast means, I'm like, well, gee, I didn't get to it today, but I can do it tomorrow because tomorrow is just like today.
Right.
And it's not working. I'll just say, I'm not going to put words on it like healthy or helpful or whatever. It's just not working for me. And so I kind of realized that recently, like I need to actually put some structure back in my life. We'll see how that works.
So,
But also I have the ability to take 2.5 weeks and drive to Texas and camp and watch the eclipse and drive home with my dog,
yeah. And this way you don't even, if you just come by my place when you're driving, you don't have to do a podcast. You could just record one and then possibly put it on your podcast.
We could do that. We might do that, So I thought of at least three times in my life when I really leaned on my program. And it had nothing to do with alcoholism.
Yeah. Because I was thinking this while you were talking. In other words, when you came to Al-Anon, you were trying to put out fires.
I was there because my wife's an alcoholic. She's now in recovery, but she sure as hell wasn't then. And my life was totally unmanageable.
So I guess the point is now you use your recovery program, not necessarily to put out these fires. It's more about the next phase. Well, Kim.
A couple of the things, at least one of the things I'm going to talk about was kind of a fire.
Okay.
And that first one, my kids were in college. One of my kids, I think it was his sophomore year in college, and he ended up in a psych ward because he had had some kind of a break, had said words that could be construed as a threat to a friend of his. And that friend, I don't know exactly how it happened, but what happened was he ended up in a locked psych ward as a danger to self or others. I think he had said something like, I feel like I want to kill either me or you. Okay, you got to respond to that, right? You can't just put that aside. So he's in Arizona. I'm in Michigan. He's in his psych ward. It's a trial just to be able to talk to him. He doesn't have a phone or anything. They take away his toothbrush after he brushes his teeth so he won't hurt himself. I mean, it's that kind of place, right? Mm-hmm. They wouldn't let him out without somebody to receive him, because as a consequence of what had happened, he had been banned from campus. So he couldn't go back to his dorm room. Mm-hmm. So he had no place to live, no place to eat because he was eating at the dorm. And they're like, yeah, we're not going to let him out and just put him on the street. So I had to go down there, and to fly down. I discovered that some airlines have fares that they'll give you a discount for this kind of situation. if you call them and talk to an actual person, which I don't know if that's even possible these days. But anyway, the night before I was going to fly down to Arizona, I went to my regular home group meeting and I was crying. I said, my son's in the psych ward and I have to go down there and I don't know what I'm going to do. And I think I said something like, if he was like going into alcoholic rehab, I'd know how to handle it, but I don't know how to handle this. And it was, it felt good to be able to say that, right? And to get love back from the people in the room. Well, it turns out I actually did know what to do. And it had nothing to do with the specific circumstance. What I needed to do was to provide him the things he could not provide for himself. And we talk in Al and I, we talk about enabling. And one of the definitions of enabling is getting between somebody and the consequences of their action and doing for them things that they can or should have done for themselves, right? So what I did was, I received him out of the psych ward. I provided him a place to live. I provided him food to eat, and I provided him transportation because when he was living on campus, he walked everywhere, right? So he then had to deal with the consequences of his actions. He had to go to the campus police station and get interviewed to see whether he would be admitted back into school or not. He had to receive a no contact restraining order from the person he had made the threat to. He had to find a new place to live because he was in the same dorm with this person, and it's really hard to have no contact if you're living down the hall, right? He had to do those things, and I helped him buy a bicycle so that he had transportation. He did those things. He got readmitted. I had a little what I call an Al-Anon relapse on the weekend when we hadn't heard back from the school counselor about whether she was going to let him back in. And I called her phone and left a voicemail, which she rightfully ignored. I never heard from her, so I assume she ignored it. And he found a friend that he could live with that had a spare bedroom that I think the situation was a little sketchy, and this also was the friend who supplied substances to him. And I expressed to him that I wasn't really wild about this choice, but it was his choice. And I would just say, I'm not wild about it, but that's all I'm going to say because that's something else I learned in Al-Anon, say it once. Don't nag. It doesn't help. It doesn't work. At the end of that week, and I will say this son we did not get along very well during his senior year of high school. And when he went off to college, I literally dropped him at the curb at the airport and said, have a nice year or whatever, Well, he came back for Christmas, so it wasn't a year. But at the end of that week, he gave me a big hug and said, thank you for coming. I don't know what I would have done without you, And the only reason I was able to do that is because what I had learned in Al-Anon about how to support somebody without fixing their life, without helping in air quotes.
Mm-hmm.
We have a saying, help is the sunny side of control.
Yeah.
Okay. So that one was kind of a fire, but I was much better prepared to meet it, even though I thought I didn't know what I needed to do. Same son, a few years later, he's going off to grad school at the University of Connecticut, which is a state that has winter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is this the same UConn that has the basketball teams?
Absolutely, yes, that has the basketball teams. Yeah. He has decided that he's going to camp in the woods while he goes to grad school. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, you mean like permanently?
Like permanently, yes.
Not
Okay.
like on a night or two.
Spoiler alert, that lasted about 2 weeks. He discovered that's a lot of work. But he had spent the summer like sleeping out in our backyard, and he bought a, tent and he bought all this gear. I don't know what happened to it. He doesn't keep stuff, so probably gave it away. And so I drove him to Connecticut. I, again, dropped him off at a curb with his bike and his backpack, not knowing where he was going to sleep that night. And said, bye, I hope this works for you, or something. Again, I don't know the exact words. And I drove away. And that was one of the hardest things to do that I've had to do in my life. I will say that as I drove away, I put a CD in my car CD player of a book about radical acceptance, because I had to accept his decision as an adult of how he was going to. We had tried to talk him out of it, and this is what he's going to do. That is that son. He's going to do what he's going to do. And the only thing that I can say, no, it's not the only thing, but a positive thing is he's never done the same, I'll say, stupid thing more than once. He's never done something that has had serious consequences more than once. He's found other things to do.
Right.
Okay. But he's never repeated the same thing.
That's good.
Okay. So far, we're good with that. And, as I said, he spent about 2 weeks doing this and discovered it was really hard and decided to find a place to rent, a room to rent, And so he got to the place where we wanted him to be, but he got there through his own route. And again, that is something that we talk about in Al-Anon is, our loved ones are going to find their own way to whatever their higher power wants for them.
Mm.
And it might not be the way we want them to get there.
That's right.
And it might not be the place we want them to go.
Mm-hmm.
And for some of us, that place ends up being death.
Yeah.
But we can make ourselves miserable trying to fix it and still have the same end. Right?
Yeah. There you have it, Mr. Spencer T, part 1. By the way, sorry about the hard stop there, but we will continue with part 2 next week with Spencer. Once again, Spencer, thank you so much for joining me. I know people are going to enjoy part 2 just as much, if not even more, than they enjoyed part 1. Now, on to a little bit of listener feedback. JD writes in. Oh, by the way, I do want to kind of put this out there just as a reminder. We don't want you sharing your toothbrush. We don't want you sharing, I don't know, your virus. Whatever. But we would love for you to pause your device and share that episode with another friend or family member. It may be just what they need today. Now, some listener feedback. JD writes in, and JD says, day 1780, checking in from the Sunshine State. JD says, hello, John. Just a quick note to let you know how grateful I am for the service for the service that your podcast provides. Sorry about that, JD. That's my fault. He says, I still look forward each week to the new stories being brought to life by you and your guests. I've been a regular listener since I discovered the podcast in 2019, and I have come to rely on my, quote, meeting between meetings, unquote. As the subject line suggests, I am celebrating 5 years clean and sober today. Good for you, JD. Congratulations. And I remember us being in those online yoga classes together, and I'm glad you're still keeping on. He says, I cannot even begin to tell you how much different my life looks now. I believe the program is divinely led. So do I, JD. And has brought and has brought so many wonderful people into my life. And then he says, quick shout out to Michael H., who is a regular listener as well. Yes, I remember Michael. And quick shout out to Michael H. And then he says, keep on doing the great work you do. This podcast is a great example of the principles and traditions in action. Keep on carrying the message, brother, with love and gratitude. JD in St. Augustine, Florida. Well, love and gratitude back out to you, my friend, and congratulations on the 5 years. That is fantastic. Rusty writes in. Now, Rusty is writing in, and I want to go ahead and give out this address again because Rusty is writing in via our P.O. box that Mr. Mike, who I am so grateful for, monitors this P.O. box in Arizona. It is Sober Speak, 1962 East Apache Boulevard, P.O. Box 7925, Tempe, Arizona, 85281. And there are some people who either cannot or like to write in letters, and Mike is so... Excuse me, not cannot. They cannot write in via email, and so they use letters to communicate with us. And Mike is like I said, he is just he's just a gem. He's been monitoring that thing. He talks to a lot of different people, and I'm so grateful for him. But anyway, Rusty writes in via Mike in what is called what Mike calls our snail mail department, which I love. And Rusty says, yo, Lil G. He says, I listened to episode number 354 with Mike P. Please pass on to him that his, quote, beginnings, unquote, are near verbatim to my own. Instead of how his father had left at age 11, my father passed away when I was 12. My older brother also drank as a teen, but graduated high school, later college, and is a successful businessman able to imbibe without dire consequences like myself. Imbibe. It's been a long time since I've seen that word actually spelled out, but I like that word, imbibe. And I get it, Rusty. I get it. He says, also at age 16, my Al-Anon mother tricked me into undergoing a, quote, evaluation to see if I had a disorder. I was flown up to St. Mary's in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Guess what? They also told me I had a problem requiring treatment, and I also ran off, but voluntarily returned after calling my mother, who assured me a plane ticket was coming for my return, also known as a lie, which then allowed the male nurses to goose march me to a lockup. Goose march. He says, I also continued to relapse off the old lie that, quote, just one wasn't too much, unquote. Yeah. That's the beauty of this program. We're all in the same boat, and only by working the program can we find lasting sobriety, as well as serenity, allowing us to regain our sanity. Also, let Mike know my sobriety date is March 13th, 1997. Well, I copied him on all of this that Mike sent over to me, Rusty, just so you know, and he was truly grateful. The other Mike P. And anyway, he says it truly works when we work it. If he or anyone else would ever like to discuss the program or hear my experience, strength, and hope, I can be e-messaged through Securus after registering through them. I'll leave my official contact info at the end of this message for you to forward to them in closing. At the end of episode number 354, John, you had forgotten how you normally close out an episode with. I think I forget that all the time. He says, try posting it in picture frames like they used to do in meeting rooms, e.g. live and let live, one day at a time, listen, learn. Your podcast is a true blessing to the friends of Bill W. who are sequestered behind concertina Oh, concertina. I believe that is a material, if I'm not mistaken. Concertina top fences with guard towers, keeping all of us in place. Until next time, John, hasta la vista, mi amigo. Unity, Service, Recovery, Rusty R. in Abilene, Texas. And then he provided me the contact information to get in touch with him. If anybody's interested in that and you want to write to me at johnjohn at soberspeak.com, I will give that to you. And then Mike writes at the end, the snail mail department continues. Peace and blessings, Mike. All right, everybody, that does it for, I believe, another episode. Well, see, here's the part where I have to remember things, but I think I'm going to be okay this time. Keep coming back. It works if you work it. May God bless you and keep you until then. I'm taking this, I almost forgot. I'm taking this 1 week at a time. I hope to be back next week. You never can tell. I've been saying that for a while, but just how we do sobriety, right? 1 day at a time. And I do this podcast 1 week at a time. Love to all of you. Thanks for listening in. And remember, we'll be back next week with part 2 of Spencer T. Bye-bye.